Welcome back for the fourth day of the Lora Sewalong. Today we are going to be sewing up the sleeve views of the Lora dress. So if you are sewing up one of the spaghetti strap views, you can skip today and come back tomorrow. You're going to start by grabbing your main dress and your lining facing, and you're going to put the lining facing on top of the main dress, right sides touching, and you're going to pin it, matching all of the notches, the dots, and the seams. Just keep in mind that the upper angled neckline of the main bodice is slightly longer than the bodice lining. This is so that it curves nicely and fits better along that neckline, bust line after you sew it. So you're going to need to ease that a teeny bit when you are pinning it and stitching it. Once pinned, it's time to go ahead and sew. So at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance, you're going to stitch up this center front edge, pivot at that dot right there at center front, all the way up to the top. You do not stitch at the underarm on the sleeve views. So go back and stitch the center back, not the underarm, and then back down the other side in the same way. Now, just to kind of reiterate, the button shield and button loops are sandwiched in between the lining facing and the main dress at this time. So not only are you attaching the lining facing, but you're also attaching those button loops and the button shield while you're sewing. Now that it's all sewn, it's time to trim the seam allowances. So you're going to trim the corners, notch the curved areas, and you're going to grade the seam allowances as much as you want. So depending on how bulky your fabric will determine how much grading or trimming you want to do. So the seam allowances along the center front help to stabilize the button loops and the buttons in later steps. So I usually just leave these as is. Now we're going to do a little bit of understitching to help that facing lining stay tucked to the inside of your dress. Especially if your lining is a different color than your main dress like mine is, you really want to make sure you do this understitching. So to do this, we are going to press the lining and the facings over the seam allowances and away from the main dress. One little extra tip that I just wanted to pop in with right now is it's a good time to just take one of your buttons and make sure that it fits into your button loops. If you need to adjust those, now's a good time to do that. Okay, now we are actually going to do the understitching. So understitching is going to be through the facing lining, also the seam allowances, and it's just about 1/16 of an inch away from that edge, and you are not going to be able to understitch into all of the corners. So usually, like, I'll go up the center front edge and then I'll stop about 1 inch before that center front corner, start again about 1 inch after, and continue going. It should also just be said that the button loops and the button shield should stay pressed towards the main dress during this process. The seam allowances of the button shield and the button loops are getting caught in the understitching, but not the actual loops or shield. Okay, now that that understitching is done, it's time to give everything a good press. Once again, especially if your lining facing is a different fabric than your main fabric like mine is, you want to make sure that you cheat that a teeny bit towards the underside, and that understitching will help you do that. Now, if you remember, we had left those underarm edges raw, so now it's time for us to go ahead and baste those together so they just kind of stay in place. So we're going to baste those at 3/8 of an inch from those raw edges. Once this is sewn, this is a good time to go ahead and try on your Lora dress and see if you need to make any adjustments to the side seams before we attach the bodice lining. Now we're going to take the bottom folded edge of the bodice lining and we are going to match it up to the seam where the main bodice meets the main skirt. I'm going to use my glue stick. I find this is a really good way to baste it and get a really precise stitch line, but you can also, of course, pin it. You just want to be really careful here because the more precise you are, just the better the fit is going to be through the bodice and the more neat it's going to look on the inside. Now you can go ahead and secure this in a couple of ways. So I'm actually going to hand sew it. This is going to give you a more high-end finish and a more precise finish. or you can actually just do a line of stitching on the right side of the fabric, about 1/16 of an inch in from that seam line. That is what I did on the spaghetti strap view of the dress. You can pop back to yesterday's sew along if you want to see that done. But like I said here, I'm just taking a little hand sewing needle and matching thread, and I'm going to do a quick little whip stitch. There's probably a few different stitches that you can do here, some that are going to be prettier than others, but I just decided to be quick and do a really fast little whip stitch. Okay, go ahead and grab one of your sleeves, and with right sides touching, you are going to line up the underarm seams, go ahead and pin that, and then we're going to go over to our machine and we will stitch that at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Unfortunately, I misplaced the video of me stitching it, but you're going to stitch it first at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to need to finish those seams. I'm serging. You can use pinking shears, you can zigzag stitch, whatever you prefer. And then of course you need to press those seam allowances. So since I serged, I'm going to press them to one side. If you did something like pinking shears, you can also just press those open. Okay, go ahead and grab your dress again, and then we're actually going to pin the underarm section of your main dress and your sleeve together with right sides touching. So make sure you are matching up the underarm seam of both the dress and your sleeve, and then of course your notches, making sure that you have the one that coordinates to whatever side you're working on. Also keep in mind that that dot right there that is on your sleeve should line up with the top edge of your dress on either side. And then go ahead and stitch that at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, now that that is sewn, you're going to grab your sleeve casings, and you're going to prepare your sleeve casings by pressing in the short ends by 1/2 inch, wrong sides touching. And then once those are pressed, you're also going to press in the unnotched long edge by 1/4 of an inch, wrong sides touching. Now to attach the sleeve casing to the top of the sleeve. So with right sides touching, you're going to pin the notched edge or the unfolded edge of the casing to the top of the sleeve. So you're going to want to match that center top notch, and then you're also going to match the dot. So keep in mind that the ends of the casing are extending about 1 inch into the underarm of the bodice on either side. If you're having a little bit of a hard time just matching this up, that is not unusual. My sleeves tend to grow after I cut them. They're really curved, and you know, this fabric is more lightweight than that I'm using for the lining. Just remember, this is all going to be gathered, so just ease it in where you can. It does not have to be exact. No one will notice if it's not exactly perfect. Okay, so now we're going to go over to our sewing machine, and we're actually going to stitch that entire casing on at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now to trim those seam allowances. So within the casing, you're going to want to trim that down to 1/4 of an inch. This is going to make room for that elastic. And then about 1 inch into the casing, and then at the entire underarm, I like to trim that down to about 3/8 of an inch, and then finish that seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to actually understitch that casing to keep it really nice and tucked to the inside of her dress. So to prepare for the understitching, the first thing that you do is you're going to press the casing away from the sleeve and over the seam allowances. And then you're going to actually stitch it, or do the understitching 1/16 of an inch into the casing through the seam allowances. Okay, now that that understitching is done, we're actually going to press the entire casing to the wrong side of the sleeve. And once again, just, you know, kind of cheat that casing a teeny bit into the sleeve so that you don't end up seeing that casing peeking out when you're wearing it. I definitely like to go ahead and put some pins in after I press it just to keep this really nice and precise. And you want to keep this as even as possible. This is what the elastic is going through. The elastic is 3/8 of an inch, so you've got to make sure that you have at least enough room for that 3/8 inch elastic. And then you're going to go over to your sewing machine and you're going to stitch along that inside folded edge of the casing from one end to the other. You're going to be creating a 1/2 inch channel here for the 3/8 inch elastic, and make sure that you backstitch at both ends. Now we get to add the elastic. So you're going to cut your elastic to the recommended length for the shoulder. Now I actually like to cut it a little bit long, knowing that I can pin it and then I can adjust it once I try it on. So go ahead and attach a safety pin to one end of the elastic and you're going to insert it through the channel. Be really careful not to twist it, and then you're going to just keep gathering the sleeve evenly as you go. And then you're going to want to pin each elastic end so that it's hidden just inside the edge of the casing, so about a 1/4 inch in from the folded edge. And then what we'll do is we'll go over to our sewing machine and we're actually going to stitch through all the layers multiple times to secure those elastic ends. Now, like I said before, I like to sew one edge and then pin the other. I usually pin the front if I'm fitting it myself, and that way I can unpin and pull on that elastic until I get it at just the right length before I stitch it down. Okay, now the top of the sleeve is done. I do like to go ahead and just kind of distribute the gathers the way that I like and then give it a little press before I move on. Now turn those sleeves inside out and we are going to fold up the lower edge of the sleeve by a 1/4 of an inch. And then you're going to fold it up again, but this time by a 1/2 an inch, and give it a nice press. If you want, you can pin this as well, but I find that pressing is enough. But essentially you're going to be creating a channel for the 3/8 inch elastic again. Once pressed, you're going to go over to your sewing machine and then you are going to stitch along that inside folded edge to create that channel for the elastic, but make sure that you leave a 1 inch opening so that you can insert your elastic. Now you're going to insert that elastic the same way that you did for the shoulder. So attach a safety pin to one end, go through the channel, go ahead and come out the other end, and this time you are going to overlap the two edges by a 1/2 an inch, pin them, and then we're going to stitch them. Now be extra careful that you're not twisting your elastic when it's going through this channel. It's easy to do. Make sure you're really secure with your stitches. So I usually reduce my stitch length a little bit, and then I usually also stitch in 2 different little spots just to give it more strength, because you do not want that popping after you've already sewn up your channel. Okay, with that elastic sewn into a ring, you want to pop that elastic back into the channel, and then you are going to stitch that channel closed. Okay, and that is it. Make sure that you have done all of the sleeve steps for both of the sleeves if you haven't already. I like to give, once again, this little elastic casing a little press once I've distributed the gathers evenly. We are done for today, so come back tomorrow and we are going to finish up our Lora dresses.